All right, I got to tell you something. I'm ready for summer to be over. Can I get any amens out there? I'm done with it. I've had it. It's enough. This is the hottest summer of my lifetime, and I don't like heat and humidity. What I do like about this region is you get four equal seasons. So one comes to an end, you're ready for the next one to begin. You know, winter comes to an end, you're so ready for spring. Spring, you're kind of looking forward to summer, for the lazy, hazy days of summer. You're ready to lay back a little bit, but man, summer in the church is not as much fun for me, because a confession I have to make to you is the more of you are out there, the better I preach. That's the truth. I'm sad to say it's true. I hate to admit it. I know it's not right. I recognize it's a character flaw. Nonetheless, it is true. So that means that if you're here right now, first of all, thank you for coming on a summer Sunday. If you're not on vacation, you might look around and feel a little left out. We wonder where all these other people are. We imagine where they might be, and we're not there. So we feel a little left out. Vacation's already come and gone for me. Any of the rest of you? That's a bad feeling. So that's past, and now I look out and I say, where are these people, and what are they doing? And I wish I were there, all those sorts of things. And then you could do something else on a summer Sunday. You always could go have a picnic, or you could take a drive, or you could sleep in, or you could watch tennis this morning in the Olympics, or you could do anything. And you chose to be here today, and I just want to tell you, if you're here on one of these really light summer Sundays, it means a lot to me, so I applaud you. Thank you for being here. And I pick a few of you out in the room who have high energy, and I key on you, and I'm going to try to bring it even though the room's not full. So that's how it goes. So we're winding this series down, this summer series. We always try to choose something in the summer that's a little different. I think we always try to choose something that, if you're here on a given Sunday, it works as a standalone. So if you miss a few Sundays, that's okay. You can be here as a standalone, but they do fit together. And one thing that gratifies me, and post-COVID, a gift we've been given, is how many people hit me up when they're out of town and they say, I watched the sermon today, or I watched it last week, or whatever the case may be. The number of people who tell me they keep up with these series anyway. Nonetheless, we're about to wind down Kings, and this, for me, has been a really fun series. We've covered a lot of ground in really a short amount of time. So this week and next week, and then we're on to something else. You might ask, what are we on to? The next 2 Sundays after that, we'll be focusing on Spend Yourself, and specifically on Chosen. And regarding Chosen, you will have an opportunity to be chosen by a child in Muchila, Zambia, the place where we work, to choose a child where we're doing development work. And that child, in a week that I'll be there, this is going to be nuts. This is a crazy turnaround for those of us doing it. But we fly out on Sunday afternoon. We get to Muchila. We get to that area sometime Monday or Tuesday. I'm not positive. And then we leave again on Friday. This is Zambia. And we come back. So this 16-and-a-half-hour flight back or so that I'll be making, the longest leg of 3 legs. And then I'm going to preach the following Sunday. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'll try to do it. And you will have an opportunity during that week while I'm there to be chosen by one of these children to be their sponsor. And that's an amazing thing. And I hope all of you will participate. So that will be a lot of fun. And then we're into the fall, and we're into the new series that we'll talk about later there. So let's wrap up Kings as we get to this point. And let me start by telling you a true story. And this story is about me. Now, God has spoken to me a lot of times in my life, even since I was a child. I don't remember a time I didn't know Jesus. I know that's different for many of you. And if you've come to Christ here and you've been baptized like so many of you here, that's fantastic and magnificent. But for me, I was reared in a Christian home. And I don't remember a time where Jesus was foreign to me, if you will. There was a time I walked away from Jesus, and I had to be brought back. God had to call me back to himself, and that's a story perhaps you've heard a time or two across the years. But from my earliest years, I remember how God spoke to me. God's often spoken to me through other people, through events that occurred, sometimes through Scripture, sometimes, as I've told you, in dreams. God has always spoken vividly to me. But in my pastoral career, in my career as a minister in a local church, there have been 2 times that God's call was incredibly distinct. The first one was when Debbie and I were pastoring in Warsaw, Virginia. Some of you don't know where that is. It's on the Northern Neck. It is a magnificent place. It is the place that time forgot, but it's a fun place to live. In those days, we ate all the crab and seafood that we wanted. We boated all the time. I hunted a lot because that's what men did there. If you wanted to hang out with men, you had to fish and hunt. That was all there was to it. The church that was there was sort of the central church in the community, and when I went to it, it was somewhat weak. It grew like crazy. It was a lot of fun pastoring there. I really enjoyed the people. We had a lot of friends. Our first child, Marley, was born while we were there. Life was good. And I got a call from a church in Lynchburg, Virginia, and that church said, hey, the chairman of the committee said, hey, we would like very much to talk with you about coming as our pastor. And I said, no, I'm not interested in making a move. And he said, well, we're really positive that God is leading us to you. I said, that's great. I'm not positive God is leading you to me any more than I am God is leading me to you. And therefore, right now, this just isn't the right time. We're in a capital campaign. We're building a new building. It's the wrong time. I can't possibly come and talk to you. The chairman was really disappointed, but he said, okay. He accepted that. Until 3 months later, I got a call from him again. He said, listen, we really would like to talk to you. I said, I understand, but I'm in the same place, and I really don't want to talk to you. And so I said to him, listen, I really appreciate your interest, but frankly, I just don't think the time is right here. Now, honestly, I wasn't sure the church was right either. This church was in the downtown location in a neighborhood in Lynchburg. Believe it or not, there are neighborhoods in Lynchburg you wouldn't want to live. It was right between a whorehouse and a crack house. This is the truth. This church had undergone dramatic decline despite its magnificent Gothic building. The church wasn't much at that moment. And in fact, a mentor of mine, a close mentor of mine, said to me, Jim, don't even think about talking to them. This is a career killer. Don't do this. Famous last words. I said no again. Several months later, he called again. I said no again. And almost a year, not quite, from the first call, I got a call from another person on the committee who said to me, listen, would you just have a conversation with me by phone? Sure. So this person said to me, I want you to know that we have spent, and I don't remember how long it was, but thousands of hours in prayer. And every time we pray together, God brings us back to you. We think you're the person to come and pastor our church. So either God is speaking the wrong thing to us or he's not talking to you. And I'd like to talk a little bit about your agreement just to pray for 1 week about this. Now, I didn't want to pray for 1 week about this. Has there ever been anything in your life you just really didn't want to pray about? Am I the only one? I mean, I still hit these times, Lord, I don't really want to talk to you about this. Thank you very much. I said, I don't know. I was pretty serious in my no. He said, I understand, but the time has changed. It's a year later, and I've been tracking your church, and the building's built and paid for. And I think you should pray about this for 1 week. And so he said, I'll tell you what I want you to do. I want you to pray at 6 in the morning with us for just 1 week. Just our team will pray, and then you pray separately. Pray with your wife. Pray whatever you choose to do. And at the end of that 1 week, I'd like you to talk to me again. So I agreed to do that. Stupid me. I prayed for 1 week, and by the end of that 1 week, I was convicted that I needed to at least have the conversation with that committee. Mostly comprised of older people, because that's primarily what the church had become. And I did meet with them, Debbie and I did, and in the course of those conversations, we were positive that God was calling us to go to that place. And when we went, I went with full knowledge that this may be my downfall. You know this church. And I went to that place. And the next 9 years were magical, amazing. That church grew 5 times over. Young people streamed in the doors. We bought the crack house and the whorehouse and tore them down. We changed the whole neighborhood. We built a building. Everything was happening in such an exciting way. I loved my staff team. I loved where we lived. I loved my kids' schools. I loved everything about where we were and was absolutely convinced I'd be there for the rest of my career. I was convinced of this. Now, if you doubt anything I'm saying here, there are a few people here who belonged to that church at that time. They followed me here. That's amazing. They're here, and they can tell you that this story is absolutely true. And at the end of that 8 or so years, I get another call from another chairman of another committee. Now listen, I got calls at this time all the time because you're in the prime of your career at about this age, and I was in my mid-30s. I'd been in my mid-20s when I went to Rivermont Avenue in Lynchburg, and I was in my mid-30s when I got this call. You're in the prime. So people call you all the time because, in case you haven't noticed, there aren't a lot of pastors out there right now. They're less and less, fewer and fewer. And this chairman said, listen, our committee has been praying about this, and we've reached the conclusion that you're the person we want to talk to. And I said, I'm really appreciative of your intrigue and interest, but the answer is an absolute no. We're in a capital campaign. We're building a building. Everything's going really well here. I feel like God has me where he wants me. The answer is an absolute no. That chair of the committee was upset, but he hung up the phone. About 3 months later, he called back. And he said to me, we'd really like to talk to you. And I said, I really don't want to talk to you. About 3 months later, he called again, and almost a year after that first call, do you want to guess what happened? Another member of the committee, this is true. The vice chair of the committee calls and says, we've prayed thousands of hours about this. We really feel you're the person to come to Columbia right now. I didn't really want to come to Columbia. I didn't think I wanted to live in Metro D.C., although I love it now. I didn't think I had any interest in that. I didn't think I wanted to come to a church that had experienced a dramatic problem and was in the middle of a kind of a season of decline. I didn't think I wanted to do that. I said to him, listen, I'm really contented where I am. This vice chair of the committee said to me, would you pray with us every morning? But he said for 2 weeks, and I said, one's enough. This is true. This is true. And for 1 week we prayed together, and at the end of that 1 week, Debbie and I were convicted we needed to have the conversation. We met that committee halfway between here and Lynchburg. Don't hold it against us, but we met at a winery. That was the place where we had dinner together. And at the dinner we were at around this table, Debbie, who did not, listen, my wife said, no way, Jose, this is not happening. I'm not moving my kids. We're not going to do this. Gotcha. I agree with you. We're at the table, and she says, I just want to know, how many people are you guys talking to right now? They look at each other and they say, one. You're it. You're the one that needs to come here. At the end of that conversation, we both got in the car and we were quiet, silent, completely silent, all the way back to our home just outside of Lynchburg and Forest. And when we got home, we really didn't say hardly one word. I turned to her and said, he's calling us again, isn't he? She said, I think so. And here we are. 22 years later, I'm still the pastor of Columbia, and I will be here till the end of my career. God's told me that, I promise you. But listen, I learned a lot in these processes. One is, you pray to God no matter what, and you listen for a response, because whatever he wants for you is better than whatever you want for yourself. Trust me on this. The second thing that I learned is that God is faithful. And if you do what God asks you to do, he will bless it. Not everything will be easy or rosy, but he will bless it if you follow his will. But the third thing I learned has to do with what happened to both of those churches after I departed. The first one declined dramatically, but that's not the one I'm most interested in. It was Rivermont that still to this day, if I talk about it, there's a pit in my stomach. There is no longer a Rivermont Avenue Baptist Church. A church that had 600 people in worship when I left is gone. It gave itself away to another church that is vibrant, and I'm grateful for that, but here's what happened. I thought the church was ready to sail, that all the values that we'd talked about, all of the energy was entrenched in the system. I thought they were ready to fly. In fact, I thought honestly that they would do better without me than with me. I thought I didn't really have a vision for the next place they were to go like I had for all the other places. I really thought they were ready to fly. They entered an interim process, and in the interim process, they continued to grow. And then they called a pastor, and that pastor's a great guy, but was a terrible fit for the congregation. And almost immediately, the church began to decline. Almost immediately. Within several years, the church was half the size it was when I left it. Once you lose that kind of steam, you're almost done. They really should have changed pastors at that point, but it's hard to do. Hard to do. And within a few years, that church was just spinning down, spinning down, spinning down. And here's what I learned. First of all, that it takes a long time to change the values of a system. Most systems have a homeostasis they'll return to apart from leadership, and that's not just pastoral leadership, it's lay leadership too. But at the end of the day, there's sort of a marriage of pastor and lay leaders that works, and the chemistry there worked, and it didn't after I was gone, just like it's worked here. And God was good to us, and He blessed us in that season. And I guess this is all according to His will, but it still breaks my heart. And here's the second thing I learned. You're not done leading anything until you have figured out what's going to happen when you're no longer there. Listen, this is important. Until you have secured your legacy, no matter where you are and what you do, until you have figured out who's going to come behind you, until you have solved that riddle, you have not done anything. Because everything that you've done can be undone, and everything can come unglued in a heartbeat in this day and time where institutions are so weak. Times have changed, and they've changed dramatically. Now, that is a lesson that I could have learned from a lot of places had I watched. Had I paid attention to other pastors and other churches, had I paid attention to some of my mentors, I could have learned this lesson, and from day one, I could have focused on this. But I didn't. And I also could have learned it from Scripture. And in the book of Kings, there is a treasure trove of leadership lessons relative to the issue of how you secure your legacy once you leave. And those lessons are found primarily in one story found in 2 chapters of 2 Kings. And those are the chapters that cover the king Hezekiah and his son Manasseh. Manasseh is a name you won't soon forget, just like Hezekiah. Do you remember from last week I told you that this is what was said by the Yahwist authors of 2 Kings about Hezekiah? There was no one like him either before or after him, and all of you agreed that if you could have this said of you sometime in your life, you'd be thrilled to have it said. And for good reason, because Hezekiah was a good king. Hezekiah was a great leader. Hezekiah was one of the most amazing leaders in all of the Bible, and certainly was the most amazing of the Judahite kings, the Judean kings. Really a remarkable guy. His tenure was amazing. What he accomplished was incredible. But like every leader and every human being, he aged and he died. And when he died, he was succeeded, and this is what would be said of his son and successor, Manasseh. He has committed these detestable sins. This is God speaking. He has done more evil even than the Amorites who preceded him. That is, even than the pagans who came before our people were in this land. He was the worst of the worst. So we go in one generation from the best of the Judean kings to the worst of the Judean kings, and it happens in a heartbeat, literally in a heartbeat, because when Hezekiah passes away, 22-year-old Manasseh rises to the throne, and when he does, he undoes everything that his father has done. He restores the high places. He lifts the Asherah poles back up. Not only that, but he himself worships Baal, and he puts altars to Baal in the temple of the one true living God. Not the courtyard, the temple. He himself sacrifices one of his own sons to Baal. And the question we come to ask is, read it with me, would you, out loud. How could the apple fall so far from the tree? Now, sometimes it's a good thing for an apple to fall far from the tree. Hezekiah fell far from the tree in a good way. But in this case, what happened is the fruit fell far from the tree and the fruit rotted. How could the apple fall so very far from the tree? How is it possible that Hezekiah, the most righteous king, the most faithful king, the best king of all Judean history, could bring into power his own son? Could bring into position his own son, and his own son could be the worst of the worst, the most rotten of the apples. How could that happen? So I looked to Scripture and I asked, do I see any clues about this. Now, there are two things I want to talk about today, and only two. The first is the character of Manasseh and what we learn about a pragmatic leader who believes that the ends justify the means in every situation. That's number one. And number two, I want to talk about, and this is something that couldn't be talked about any other time, I think, in this book, how do we succeed in succession? So it's interesting that Guy did that little piece today in the offertory piece because I'm going to teach about leadership today, Guy. So wherever you are, you'll be happy today. Guy, he really only likes the ones about leadership. That's the truth. So here's 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 21, chapter 21, verses 1 through 6, chapter 21, verse 16, and chapter 21, verses 19 through 24. That's a snapshot of this chapter to tell you what it says. Now Hezekiah rested with his ancestors, and Manasseh his son succeeded him as king. Now, before you go further, I want you to pay attention here to this statement that Hezekiah rested with his ancestors, which has been said of every Israel king, Sumerian king, and every Judean king to this point. Rested with his ancestors in Judah meant that the king was buried within David's ancient city. The burial place of the kings you can go to today. It's been excavated. And so it is a remarkable thing to see that all the kings are placed in the same point of honor when they go. And Hezekiah is no less that reality. I'm sure all the priests came to celebrate. I'm sure everybody in the land mourned. I'm sure that all of that happened. Hezekiah rested with his ancestors. And Manasseh, his son, succeeded him as king. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king. Now, pay attention to that, 12 years old. How is it possible that a relatively old king should bring his 12-year-old son to the throne? I think I've got an answer for that, but we'll come back to it in a moment. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 55 years, which is roughly twice as long as his father Hezekiah reigned, meaning he could do twice the damage. His mother's name was Hephzibah, and his father's name, that's right. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He also erected altars to Baal and made an Asherah pole, as Ahab, king of Israel, had done. He bowed down to all the starry host and he worshiped them. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, "In Jerusalem I will put my name." In the two courts of the temple of the Lord, he built altars to all the starry host. He sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced divination, sought omens, and consulted mediums and spirits. Now, let's pause here for a second, because how could it be possible that a 12-year-old king would come to the throne? Well, if you kill your son, if you sacrifice your son earlier in your life, then you're going to have to produce another heir, another son, to take the throne. And the first one would have been probably much older when he came to the throne, and perhaps much more tutored and much wiser than was this young man. So in sacrificing a son to Baal, not only was this detestable in every possible way, but it was a stupid political thing to do, because it's the first time, but not the last time, that this man doesn't pay attention to his own lineage, to his own leadership and who comes behind him. He consulted mediums and spirits. He did so much evil in the eyes of the Lord, and he aroused the Lord's anger. Moreover, Manasseh also shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from end to end, besides the sin that he had caused Judah to commit, so that they did evil too in the eyes of the Lord, just like their king. Now, the conclusion of this is his son Amon. Amon was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem just 2 years. His mother's name was Meshullemeth, daughter of Heres. She was from Jobah. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, as his father Manasseh had done. He followed completely the ways of his father, worshiping the idols his father had worshiped, and bowing down to them, he forsook the Lord, the God of his ancestors, and did not walk in obedience to him. And Amon's own officials conspired against him and assassinated the king in his palace after just 2 years. And then the people of the land killed all who had plotted against King Amon, and they made Josiah, his son, king in his place. Now let me point out first of all that when Manasseh dies, he is not buried with his ancestors in the old city of David. Instead, Manasseh is buried in his own vegetable garden. You tell me, how much did the people honor him? And if that was a bad sign, then the fact that his own court officials assassinated his son and heir only 2 years in tells you that everybody in Jerusalem hated Manasseh, but he was a powerful king. In fact, let me tell you that history shines brightly on Manasseh. If you look at the Assyrian records of history, which is all we have beside the Bible, they say this was a remarkable period of peace and prosperity for Judah, sparked by a very vibrant olive oil trade. And that's not a surprise, because you need to know that Manasseh made himself a vassal to the king of Assyria. He figured, hey, if you can't beat them, join them. I don't want to fight them like my father did. I don't want to have my city besieged. And so therefore, I'll give up the uniqueness of Judah and its embodiment of the covenant with God, and I will instead become a vassal of the powerful Assyrian king. And I suspect that all the gentry in the lands were pleased with him because of two things. First of all, that Manasseh allowed them to worship the idols they wanted to. They'd wanted to for years. And secondly, that he made them prosperous and gave them a time of peace. But it would be the beginning of the end for their nation. In just a few short years, that nation would come to an end. Now, here's what I want to talk about. First of all, character and capacity. Character and capacity. If you come to me and you ask, what are the two key things we should look for in a leader? The answer is character and capacity, in that order. Capacity is a magnificent thing. It's when your ceiling is high. It's when you can accomplish a lot. It's when people follow your leadership. It's when you're really capable. You're really competent. That's capacity. But it pales in comparison to character. Because a person who has great capacity but has no character will reap more destruction than a person who is an imbecile and has a ton of or has no character at all. The danger of mixing no character with high capacity is higher than the danger of either or both not being there. So what you're looking for in a leader is character and capacity. Now let me come back to my story. When I came to Columbia, there was somebody that most of you wouldn't know. The granddaddy of all church consultants was a kind of a quirky guy named Lyle Schaller, who lived in Chicago. I knew all about Lyle Schaller because I'd studied about him in seminary, and through the Baptist General Association of Virginia and one of its leaders, Glenn, I got to know Lyle Schaller. And so Lyle Schaller said, look, I think Columbia is really important, and for that reason, if you will bring a group of your leaders down at your expense, I'll consult with you for 3 days for free. I'll just let you sit with me for 3 days, and we'll talk about all sorts of things for those 3 days for free. Now, this is a guy who cost thousands upon thousands of dollars a day, so this was a tremendous gift. So I collected a group of my staff at that time and a group of lay leaders, a few of whom are still here, and we flew out to Chicago, and we stayed just outside Chicago, and we actually went to Lyle Schaller's home. I ate soup at Lyle Schaller's table. His wife fed us soup and sandwiches all 3 days. And we sat in this room, and we talked about all sorts of things regarding Columbia. And as those who were present will be my witness, on day one, he said, here are the top 5 issues I see for Columbia under your tenure, in the time of your tenure. And number 2 among those was succession. Now listen, I was 37 years old when I sat in Lyle Schaller's living room. 37 years old. I wasn't going anywhere. And when he said that, I said, you must be kidding me. Out loud, I said, you must be kidding me. Succession. I said, Lyle, trust me. I'll be here for the rest of my career. I got plenty of time. He goes, I hear you. But it takes a long time to change a system, and you've got to start focusing on succession right now. He said something wise. He said, it is difficult to succeed in succession. It takes many years, not 1 or 2. And so he said, you've got to start paying attention to that right now. I said, what makes you think that? He said, because your church just had a major succession crisis. An incredibly successful pastor who was here for many years retired. The next person who came, many of you were here at the time, was incredibly gifted, but it was a bad match. And the church went through a really tumultuous several years in which it lost a lot of people and a lot of momentum. That's the church I came to. He said, you had a succession crisis. He said, so that's ingrained in your system. So in order to undo that, you've got to start paying attention to succession now. I'm like, man, how do I do that? I mean, you don't want me to go before my congregation and say, let's prepare for the person who's going to follow me. I'm 37. I just got here. You don't want me to do that? He goes, no. He said, what I want you to do is I want you to set up a system where you are filing through young leaders all the time, really bright young leaders. And I want you to watch those young leaders. And he said, at some point, one of them is going to stick. I said, what do you mean one of them's going to stick? He said, trust me, you'll know. He said, at some point, one of them will rise above the others. Everybody will look to that person for wisdom. That person will have incredibly high capabilities. You'll notice it. You'll know. And within a year of Chris Clifford arriving here as a resident, within a year, I knew he was probably the one. I didn't tell you yet. I didn't tell him yet. But I was watching, and I knew. So what I did at that point, I was 40, is I started to pour myself into him, to teach him everything right and wrong I knew, all the mistakes I'd made, all the things I'd learned to do, whatever. I started to pour myself into him and give him access to my personal life, access to my marriage, access to my home, access to my parenting, access to everything. I wanted him to know everything, good and bad, about me. And then at the right moment, years later, I said to him, Chris, I just want to tell you, you and I should pray about this. I think you could be the person who should succeed me. And we started praying about that. I asked our elders to start praying with me about that. Is he the right guy? I started to talk to other leadership teams about that. People started to agree with me, which is important in a Baptist congregation. Did you agree with my judgment? And 2 years ago, you almost unanimously called him as my co-pastor. Because along the way, I decided, why wait until I'm dead and gone or whatever takes me out of here? Why wait until that moment? We should just lead together. Polycentric leadership is a powerful thing. Our being co-pastors, I think, is one of the best things that's happened to this church in the recent years, and certainly one of the best things that's happened in my lifetime. It's a magnificent thing. I'm telling you, every church should do it. And that's what happened. And you asked me, what is it you saw in Chris? And the answer is 2 things, character and capacity. Now let's talk about capacity first. In case you haven't noticed, Chris is a remarkably talented guy. But as talented as you think he is as a leader, as a teacher, as a preacher, as in all sorts of ways, as talented as you think he is, what I know is he is not even close to his ceiling. That's the good news for you. The bad news for you is at 59 years old, I am at my ceiling. It doesn't get any better than this. I'm only going to get worse from this point forward. It's true. Chris is still growing. Do you agree with me? Every sermon he preaches is better than the last one? If you've been around him in leadership circles, what he's learning and what he's doing, it's really remarkable. I'm learning things from him. But listen, that capacity, as remarkable as it is nothing compared to his character. And that's what I cared about most. It has to be a man after God's own heart. It has to be someone with a deep life of prayer. It has to be somebody who is a committed husband and father. It has to be somebody who really, really deeply loves people and really cares about those he leads. Because if that leader is a pragmatic leader for whom the ends justify the means and they have capacity, they will destroy the institution and the people in it. Let me tell you something, friends. Around our nation today are many, many pastors who have high capacity but not enough character. I'm telling you. And what's happening is they get power hungry and they get They get enamored with themselves. They start to read their own press releases, and before long, they destroy people. It's happening over and over and over again. Where did they learn that? From all the other leaders in our land. These are also our business leaders in many cases. These are in many cases our government leaders. We have become a very pragmatic people. We will sell our principles like a bowl of porridge just to get what we want. And whenever you do that, the end is near. Destruction is coming. So my question with Chris was, what is your character? You see, by giving him access to my life, I gained access to his. I know more about him than I do my own brothers. I'm telling you, this is a man of remarkable capacity and character, but I'm also telling you that you've got to always succeed at succession. And this is true not only for me, it's also true of you. Think about where you are and where you serve. Who is coming behind you, and how are you pouring your life into them? Now let's think about in the case of Hezekiah, because by failing with Manasseh in the area of succession, he's failed in two ways, hasn't he? So first of all, he's failed as a king, and secondly, he's failed as what? A father. The most important succession there ever will be is your children. No matter how you succeed or fail in the world. It's what you pass on to your children that is of greater value. And we need a generation of Jesus followers who pass on amazing values to their children. Do you agree with me? See, we can change the world with our families. And that's not just those of you who have children, but if you don't have children, find someone else's and invest in them. One of my core principles has been making a point of investing in the next generations as much as I possibly can. I don't get paid for that. It's just what a pastor ought to be doing. And it's what every one of you should be doing too. How are you passing your best on to the next generation so they can carry the legacy forward? And if you're thinking about it right now and recognizing, I'm really not doing that anywhere, then you're failing. Because the scriptures are quite clear here. One generation teaches the next to honor God. One generation teaches the next to live lives that are worthy of God. One generation teaches the next to follow Jesus. That's how it works. That's discipleship at its core, at its essence. So I started looking and seeing, this is the man that God's brought to us, in whose character I trust completely, and in whose capacity I am most impressed. That's what happened. This is something Hezekiah failed to do. Now, we don't have like volumes and volumes here. We just have a few core pieces. So the thing is, I think in those few core pieces, we've got enough to tell what happened. So last week, I didn't read this part. 2 Kings chapter 20, verses 12 through 19. At that time, Marduk-Baladan, I did read the first part, son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent Hezekiah letters and a gift because he had heard of Hezekiah's illness, which Hezekiah remembered. A miracle. He survived. He put figs on himself, but he prayed and God gave him 15 more years. And Hezekiah received the envoys of Babylon, and he showed them all that was in his storehouses, the silver, the gold, the spices, the olive oil, his armory, and everything found among the treasures. And there was nothing in his palace or in all the kingdom that Hezekiah did not show them. And then here's the part I didn't read. Isaiah the prophet, the famous Isaiah the prophet, went to King Hezekiah and asked, "What did those men say? And where did they come from?" "From a distant land," Hezekiah replied. "They came from Babylon." At this point, who's worried about Babylon? Do you remember what we call the captivity that's coming? The Babylonian captivity. This is the rising threat in the world to a little country like Judah. Hezekiah replied, "They came from Babylon." And the prophet asked, "What did they see in your palace?" Which Isaiah already knows because God's told him. "They saw everything in my palace," Hezekiah said. "There is nothing among my treasures that I did not show them." And then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord then. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your predecessors have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord." And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Now listen to what Hezekiah's response is, because this is important. The word of the Lord you have spoken is good. Now that's not how I'd describe it. I'd be like, what? What have I done? What a mistake. This is horrible. This is a terrifying word from God. But listen to why it's good. The word of the Lord you've spoken is good, Hezekiah says to Isaiah. For he thought to himself, well, there will be peace and security in what? My lifetime. Now here, I think what we see when we talk about succeeding in succession and fatherhood, which in this case are the same thing, and that's a problematic thing. That in itself is idolatry of the people. As you remember, they weren't supposed to have a king. But the problems here, I think, are already pointed out to us in these little pieces. Number one, not only was Hezekiah a braggart, but he had at his core the narcissism, apparently, in his old age that causes one to become a braggart. And that means that his identity was all wrapped up, not in his character, but in his capacity, right? He'd become proud of his accomplishments. He was no longer equally divided, equally weighted between meek dependence on God and personal, powerful agency. That's what he'd been in his early career. That's what caused him to succeed. But now he'd forgotten the meekness before God piece. And what he remembered was how much he'd accomplished. Now, that'd be tempting, right? You're the only one among all the kings that survived the siege of the Assyrians. You expand the capacity of the country and its borders. The country thrives under your leadership. And not only that, but you survive death, and God tells you, I'll give you 15 more years. Pretty amazing. God sort of changes his mind, says, I'll give you 15 more years. Pretty amazing. And what probably happened, I think, is that Hezekiah, in his latter years, started to feel invincible. And when one feels invincible, everybody around can tell. That is the very definition of a narcissist. Somebody who's completely absorbed in themselves and cannot imagine the world or anything else without them. Without their leadership, they're the only ones who can get it done. No one else in all the world is suitable to do what they do. And in this case, I think what happened is that Hezekiah read too many of his own press releases, and he got proud. Pride goeth before the fall. And what happens when a parent is so engaged in their work, their identity is so much about their work that they forget the most important two things that they are if they're a parent, and that's a spouse and a parent, and before that, a follower of Jesus. In this case, a follower of God. Hezekiah was so wrapped up in his career and himself that I doubt he had much time for little Manasseh. Cat's in the cradle, right? Cat's in the cradle. Not only that, but he wasn't thinking past his own time. That's a huge problem. For someone who's grounded in eternity, which is what God's all about, and in God's eternal plan, right? Do you agree with me that every one of us should be thinking beyond our own time? Not just to the point of your death, but beyond your death, and not just to the end of your career, but beyond the end of your career. Whatever you lead, you should be thinking about what will happen to those I love and lead after I am gone. If you want to succeed in succession, two things must be true. First of all, you must get out of your head that you're the only one who can do it. You must get out of your head anything that would cause you to believe that your career makes you special in any way, shape, or form. You're just one link in a chain. You have one short window, and it will come closed fast. Trust me, at the end, when you are gone, someone else will stand in your shoes. The question is, will they do it well? The question is, will they do it well, especially if you're doing it well? All of us, as followers of Jesus, with our eyes on eternity, need to have fixed in our minds that it is our responsibility what happens after we're gone. Agreed? Hezekiah forgot that. He didn't have time for his kid, who was his successor. And at the end of the day, he forgot to think past his demise. So if you want to succeed at succession, you've got to be thinking past yourself. And when you're thinking past yourself and about yourself, you've got to think about two things. The scriptures are clear here: character and capacity. High character and high capacity are dynamite. There's no stopping that. Low character and high capacity are dynamite. They will blow everything to bits. And no character and no capacity means you're better being a follower than a leader. So at the end of the day, do you have character and capacity? And who coming behind you has character and capacity? Now listen, it's all coming unglued now. It's about to go down the drain. Pretty soon here we get to the end of Judah with a little bright spot in Josiah. That's next week. But before that, we're going to get to the end of this nation and to the Babylonian captivity. It's all been a downward terrible spiral with just a few breaks along the way, a few upward movements along the way. If Hezekiah was a break along the way, the best of the best, Manasseh was the worst of the worst. And if you're reading this as a novel, you feel a little bit in despair at this point. If you're watching a movie, you're like, oh, this is a terrible movie. It's a really sad movie. But this movie's not about Hezekiah, and it's not about Manasseh, and it's not about Amon, and it's not about Josiah, and it's not about David, and it's not about Solomon. It's not about any of them. This book is really about the sovereignty of God. God is the only king, the only sovereign. No other king will do, and no other king should ever be affirmed. And in that sense, this book is about how God's plan was working its way out, even while things were spinning down about as fast as they possibly could. Now, last week I alluded to this, but if you get to the first chapter of Matthew, when you start to do your Christmas reading this year, don't skip over the genealogy. The names are hard to pronounce, it's a little boring, but don't skip over it. Here's what happens in the genealogy. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother was Uriah's wife. Solomon, the father of Rehoboam. Rehoboam, the father of Abijah. Abijah, the father of Asa. Asa, the father of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat, the father of Jehoram. Jehoram, the father of Uzziah. Uzziah, the father of Jotham. Jotham, the father of Ahaz. Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah. Now, if you get to this point, you go, oh man, thank God. See, Hezekiah is in Jesus' family tree. The best king that ever was in Judah is in Jesus' family tree. David, Hezekiah, everything's going along well. And then I'm going to tell you now, it's going to get to Jesus somehow, and you go, that must be through Manasseh's brother or sister. Nope. Hezekiah, the father of Manasseh. Manasseh, the father of Amon. Amon, the father of Josiah, and Josiah, the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of the exile of Babylon. And eventually we will get to Joseph, and we will get to Jesus. And what you need to see is the best king that ever was in Judah is in Jesus' family tree. But so is the worst. The most faithful king that ever was in Judah is in Jesus' family tree, and so is the most faithless and godless. Don't you love how when we tell about our history and our heritage, we just tell about the impressive people, right? If you have one in there, you can make one up. You don't tell about the horse thief or the drunk or whatever the case may be. But Matthew tells us, look, in Jesus' family tree is all of the best and worst of humanity. That's the essence of the human condition. And what Matthew is telling us here is that God's perfect will be done no matter the state of human affairs. That's the good news. When people lose faith in human affairs, they finally decide that the king we want was never the king we needed. And the only king we need is Jesus Christ, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So, Father, we are learning through this study of Kings and the rest of your word that your perfect will is being worked out in our lives. And here's our prayer, that we each individually would be called to listen to that will and obey it. And Lord, would you help us to engender in our hearts and minds and spirits, by the power of the Holy Spirit, not only high capacity, not only brilliant capabilities, but also the character that makes us worthy of using them for your glory. And Father, help us always to discover those you're calling forward behind us, that as we invest in them, you through us are pouring into their lives. And Lord, give us a vision for a future beyond ourselves. Give us a vision for the best that can be, for those we love and lead beyond our times. Even as you are giving us a vision for the new heaven and a new earth, the resurrection of the dead, and the glory that in finality will demonstrate to us your supremacy, your sovereignty as the only great King and Creator of the universe. This we pray in the name of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, even Jesus. Amen. Watch a couple of announcements before you go.